And so there's this subconscious belief within medicine of let's just push through. It's mind over matter. But in Ayurveda, interestingly enough, I like to turn that upside down and say it's matter over mind.
I'm Heather Grish, and this is the Wisdom of the Body podcast. This podcast explores the idea of body intelligence as the real key to learning the knowledge of life, or what we call Ayurveda in the ancient language of Sanskrit. We do that by connecting with today's creative leaders and experts who will help you listen to your body, trust your gut, and live in deeper harmony with nature. Come join me as we unlock the golden door to clear, direct perception and become very deep listeners. You can find the Wisdom of the Body podcast on Apple, Spotify, and Stitcher. You can also follow us by joining my email at heathergrish.com or on Instagram at heathergrish. I know you're going to love this podcast, so take a second right now to subscribe. Today, I'm here with Dr. Siri Chand Khalsa, physician leader in the fields of integrative and lifestyle medicine. Dr. Khalsa has had a lifelong interest in mindful living as the basis for long-term vitality of mind, body, and spirit. She completed a residency in internal medicine at the Mayo Clinic in 2005 and is board certified in internal medicine, integrative medicine, and hospice and palliative medicine. Dr. Khalsa is deep in her studies on health and healing by becoming a yoga instructor, a Reiki master, and participating in a 2-year full-time program on Ayurveda at the Ayurvedic Institute in Albuquerque and in India. Serving as an integrative medicine PCP, an instructor at the University of Arizona Integrative Medicine Fellowship for physicians, and consultant to other medical practices, she has dedicated her career to promoting an increased understanding in clinical medicine of the link between long-term vitality and the daily choices we make. She's currently focusing her energy to support physicians who want to expand their personal understanding of new ways of healing through an experiential process utilizing techniques in Ayurveda, yoga, mindfulness, and plant-based nutrition. Thanks so much for joining us today, Siri Chand.
Hi, Heather. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited to speak with you. You're just such a joy, and I've really enjoyed getting to know you over this last year. And in doing my research for even to interview you today, there's so much I learned about you and so much more I know I'm going to learn today. I didn't realize that you practiced in primary care for so long previously. And now that you've shifted your practice, so you're supporting physicians in various ways. So you've come at this from various perspectives. What changes would you like to see in medicine?
Well, it's such a great question, and it's one that I've given so much thought to. And when you've taken that sort of journey like I have, and my career started at a pretty formal institution, it's the Mayo Clinic, there's formal didactics, and when I was there from 2002 to 2005, principles of integrative medicine were largely absent. There wasn't an extensive curriculum on lifestyle changes. There was very little emphasis on stress reduction, nutritional patterns, sleep patterns. And I was really an outlier way back then. I mean, in that model at that time, it was really looking at the latter stages of disease, and particularly at the Mayo Clinic, which is a tertiary care referral center where you're seeing problems that smaller hospitals and clinics couldn't solve. So I got to see very complex medical cases, but always in the back of my head, there was this idea that we could still be making consistent changes that would support the course of the disease. Now, maybe some diseases are progressed enough that reversal is going to be very difficult, but things that bring more ease, more calibration to a sense of purpose. So that was a very interesting time because I came into that training with a very clear sense of the value of the principles that are held in integrative and lifestyle medicine. So it's been a long journey for me, that we're talking almost 20 years now since I started my training and over 20 since I was in medical school. And even before medical school, I had taken several years off to consider possibly going to naturopathic school or acupuncture school or studying Ayurveda back in the 90s with Dr. Ladd. It would have been very, very different experience than when I went later. But it was an important part of my own journey to understand, even prior to being brought into this current, some would say allopathic system, to explore other pathways of healing. And I'd always had a vision of trying to bring the ancient knowledge, the wisdom of the earth, of indigenous peoples, as well as modern innovation, and find that intersection point in medicine where you can really nurture vitality, you can nurture self-growth at physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual levels. And I did spend a long time in that system hoping for that change. And probably, as the listeners may intuit, eventually I reached an intersection where I thought, I just can't continue to try to bring change to a system that's moving at a very different pace than my own evolution, and really stepped fully away from the model that I had been trained in and the care plans and ways of thinking about medicine that had been so integrated formally into my training.
Wow, that really just hit home for me. Because you know that I also, well, I'm not going to say that you've switched careers because you're still working in medicine, but you're certainly coming at the field from a different angle now, having changed roles in a way. And I really relate to, you said that you can't continue to bring change to a system that's like moving at a different pace than the growth that you want to have. And I think I felt that way as well when I was in the health insurance industry and working in Obamacare and stuff like that. So I really relate to that. And I'm just kind of curious because whenever people make a big change in their life, I know certainly this was the case for me. Did you have like an event that was, okay, this, I definitely need to make this switch now?
Well, it's interesting because, I think sometimes we just have a moment in time where it's like the timer pops. You've been percolating and percolating. I don't want to use the analogy of turkey because I don't eat meat anymore, but I guess that's what's coming to my mind is sort of like when we were younger and we'd have Thanksgiving and the timer would pop and you'd be like, oh, okay, the turkey's done. Like that's how it felt for me. There was just an internal timer. And I was at work one week and my immediate supervisor, who was a physician, came in to review some things with me. And it just was so clear in that moment to me that things were just not going to shift. And I just said, okay, I'm going to think about this over the weekend, the things you've told me. I didn't get really angry. I wanted to get very angry, but I didn't. I came back on Monday and basically said, okay, I'm giving you my 30 days notice. And I actually had, at that particular point, this was in 2018, I thought that perhaps I would go and open my own practice. But interestingly enough, about 3 months later, my father, who I was very close to, became very critically ill. His heart valve was infected and it basically was leading to severe heart failure. And he had a very valiant course in the ICU. And when that happened, it was very internally confrontational because there was a deep and vast spiritual process happening at the same time as was intersecting with all my medical knowledge. And it created like a PTSD for me, like to be perfectly honest. It was very difficult to function for quite a while after that. And I developed severe migraines and something called occipital neuralgia. So mentally I was like, oh, I can handle this. I can do this. But then my body took on a very different narrative and became a very powerful teacher of transformation for me that really lasted for about 18 months and required me to go back into all the things that I'd been wanting to offer to people, to offer them to myself. And sometimes the healer themselves has to go embark on that healing journey. And so yet again, I found myself exploring Ayurvedic body treatments and craniosacral therapy and osteopathic manipulation. Because for those that may not know, occipital neuralgia is an exquisite pain. Like it's a very particular pain. And facial pain is also sort of in this realm where it's sort of intolerable. Like you really just can't function. And I really did not want to move deeply into the Western pharmacologic treatment paradigm. So I was sort of between a rock and a hard place because I knew that some of the processes that my colleagues might have recommended to me would ease the pain temporarily. There were structural things somehow and internal process things that needed to get worked on. And so it was not an easy transition, but through that time, a deeper sense of purpose and a new or different lens and way to approach my career began to emerge. For a while there, I was pretty much thinking I might just open a floral shop and walk away from it all because I couldn't find a way to negotiate how powerful the experience my body was having pain-wise.
I love what you said about the healer must embark on the healing journey. And I've never practiced with medicine with the type of intensity that I think conventional Western medical doctors do because of the conditions and the situations that they're placed in. And what you said about the experience with your father, I wonder if it was difficult to, I mean, to a certain extent, when you're dealing with something difficult in front of you, as physicians do, it's like there are some very difficult things people are seeing all the time, but there's no emotional connection to those people. So there's a way to keep a clear head. And there's something about attachment, I would think, that would make it different to be present when someone that you love is having a medical issue and you're trained in that way. To have to switch gears seems a little unfair, actually.
Yeah, I actually, in hindsight, did feel it was a little unfair, to whomever we say these things to. I certainly said it. I thought, this is sort of ridiculous, really. How come this is happening? But of course, we know that those questions rarely lead to any internal resolve or sense of peacefulness. But it was very confrontational because those emotions, and I'm actually very empathic to my patients' pain and trouble. So in some ways, in the allopathic clinical pathway provides you a buffer emotionally from the experience of your patients, your clients, people you're working with, supporting. I, however, have never fully been able to create enough buffer between me and the other person that I didn't experience some of their emotional process with them. And I can remember even back into when I was training and working in the ICU, and families would come in and you could feel the grief and the heaviness would arrive when we knew that that individual, that soul, that person was never leaving the hospital. And there was just something sort of so cumulative for me in this moment with him that I'd had this long career that had been largely frustrating. I had tried so many different places to create change and it had been largely very unrewarding. Just institutions are very slow to move, and the way that the billing and the finance structurally moves through medicine could do a whole nother podcast on how fundamentally flawed it is. But there was just something so profound and almost like a waterfall. I just couldn't create any sort of barrier to navigate the intensity of emotions and the fact that I was also being asked to deliver insight to the family about what was happening, to dig into some of the clinical decisions that needed to be made, which also included removing life support for him. When he came out of his surgery, he was very, very critically ill and may well have died in the next several of days. But I had known he had always been so clear to me that that was not a process or a journey he wanted to be on. And though he had managed to survive the surgery where they replaced the valve in his heart and repaired some vessels in his heart, I felt that because he had had a heart attack in the procedure and probably anoxic brain injury, that whatever quality of life was going to emerge would not be meaningful to him. So we also made the decision very soon after surgery to withdraw support. And, I was navigating the level of appreciating the surrender and the magnificence of death in the context of my own loss. It was really difficult. Obviously, like I said, there was no way to have prepared for it because certainly through my career, I had been through a myriad of endless, intense, and difficult situations. The way that practices get set up, often the person that has knowledge or insight integrative ends up seeing the more complex patients because they don't fit easily into solutions. They often need a more dimensional look at what's happening. So it may just well have been the accumulation of everything sort of swirling into that moment. But it was a very interesting transition time. I really see that as, you're walking from east to west almost. You cross over the midline.
Wow. I'm obsessed with this show called Call the Midwife.
Yes, yes. I haven't seen much of it, but I've seen some of it.
There was this really great episode. There've been a couple, but one of the themes that they started playing with toward the end on the show was one of the midwives goes and works in this larger institution. She's working in this small little group that's based out of a convent, and they're able to really provide very personalized care to people because of the way that their model is set up. And they live together, they work together. It's like a team, and they flex, and they don't have strict rigid rules about these are your hours that you clock in and clock out and all that you kind of need in bigger systems that require more organization. And I know I was just thinking about that a little bit because I think that one of the biggest challenges in the healthcare system is just the largeness of the
Yes,
systems and how rigid they become when humans are involved. Humans are imperfect, and nature doesn't operate on a clock.
yeah, exactly.
Right. So that's really frustrating. And it's frustrating for everyone involved. I know, having been a person who was involved more in the administrative side of things in that capacity myself, and you being sort of in the fire on the ground dealing with that, I would imagine that would be even more intense. And I know that there's an epidemic now of physician burnout, and it's one of the things that you've been working on. And we knew that there was this epidemic of physician burnout that existed even before the pandemic, and then obviously you slap pandemic onto things, and things aren't going to get any better in that regard. And then you add all the PPE and all that. So I know this is an area that you're really passionate about, is working with physicians to help them in these situations and help them with their self-care, really. And I know that when I was in Ayurveda school, like you said, you were kind of a rare bird, studying Ayurveda as a medical doctor when you did. And I think in my master's class, we had, say like 16 people. We had, I think, one medical doctor who was in our class. So it does seem, though, that the interest in Ayurveda has been increasing a lot, and that it definitely increased a lot in the last year. And I don't know why this happened, but last year, because I work with women on fertility
Hmm.
journeys, and I think about 75% of my clients last year were doctors or nurse
Mm-hmm.
practitioners or psychiatrists. It changed a little bit this year, but for some reason last year, I was just, kind of curious if it was just pandemic, burnout, looking for other alternatives. Do you think that there's a growth happening with interest in Ayurveda with medical doctors?
Absolutely. Yes. And what's interesting, there's two reasons I think this is happening. The first is that it is included in the curriculum for integrative medicine fellowships. So, in the US, we definitely see more integration of traditional Chinese medicine and, acupuncture and the botanical medicine, moxibustion, the whole clinical picture that exists there. You can travel even to small towns in the US and possibly see an acupuncture clinic, and the efficacy and the methodology of delivering it. I think that's been slowly evolving and more prominent. Interestingly, Ayurveda, which has similar roots, if you will, didn't see the same sort of emergence at the same time, but yoga did in the 70s and 80s. Yoga has slowly now begun to become very integrated. So it's integrated into yoga teacher training curriculum, which physicians are doing. And it's also in the integrative medicine fellowship training. And I think there's also a large contingency of South Asian physicians for whom it was in their family or they learned about it, and they're going back in and discovering what was that was part of the family healing system that they maybe didn't learn as much or didn't integrate into their lives when they became more invested into what the allopathic classical journey is. And, the other piece of it that I think is remarkably powerful, and I always like to tell this story because I think it's really important. And most people know Dr. Dean Ornish, and he's sort of the grandfather by now of lifestyle medicine. And he's definitely brought a remarkable awareness about the daily aspects that help us shift how genes are expressed. And I know you've had some amazing guests on your podcast talking about these pathways and processes. And I loved when I first learned from him that he was actually suicidal in medical school. And this is well documented. He talks about it. Came home one day into the family living room, and his sister had invited a Swami, a teacher from India. This is in the 70s, Swami Sachdananda. And I believe at that point he was either in his residency or fellowship or medical school. I don't remember exactly where. But this teacher, Swami Sachdananda, said, I have some things that I think will help you. And this isn't really about a pharmaceutical intervention, though I certainly believe that at times that's 100% appropriate. But in his circumstance, he taught him to eat differently, to move differently, to think differently, to breathe differently. He taught him some very beautiful, simple, but very powerful aspects of the Vedic knowledge. And Dr. Ornish took that back with him, and it was the basis for a lot of his research, which has been so groundbreaking that he's been able to create a program that's for individuals who have had a heart attack, who would like to go deep into their lifestyle. And his program has 4 components: movement, stress reduction, loving connection, and plant predominant low fat diet. And his data is very remarkably shown even reversal of things that in my training pathway we would say, oh, that's impossible. And that has now imbued its way into the lifestyle medicine, which is now a growing field in medicine, which has 6 pillars, which are removing harmful substances, movement, again, varying depending on the individual, but exercise, restorative sleep, a plant-based diet, loving connection, so a sense of community, and stress reduction. And those 6 pillars are really, I see it as a circle within the circle of Ayurveda. And because of that, there's a lot of interest in the lifestyle medicine community as well, as they begin to learn that so much of the foundations and pillars that formed lifestyle medicine are actually deeply held in Ayurveda. So there is a series of sort of light bulb moments for people that's been really fascinating for me to watch as someone who's really sort of walked deeply into both training pathways.
It's so interesting hearing you. I've actually not heard the 6 pillars of the practice of lifestyle medicine as it is in the modern paradigm, but I was sort of like, that's a Rajas pacifying prescription right there.
Amazing.
It's so funny because, it's like so much is going on with Vata and Pitta in society. I actually met Dean before. We actually live in the same town.
Oh, small world.
Yeah. And he's super cool. I actually did a little bit of work with his organization in the past. And yeah, I think he's a great example of, I'm so glad that you brought him up, because whenever I think of Dean, I think about this idea of how the evidence base influences medicine, because, one of the things I remember him saying was that it took him like 15 years to get enough data, and then maybe meeting Bill Clinton, getting him to become a vegan, that got Medicare to cover his lifestyle intervention. And it's sort of considering that if you look at maybe some of the alternative medicines or the indigenous medicines as, in a way, breeding grounds of innovation for medicine, but not in the sense of innovation with technology and innovation in the sense that everybody thinks of innovation, but the kind of innovation that actually helps people get healthier. It takes a lot to prove that certain methods work in order to get things adopted on a wider scale. So it seems like one of the challenges that we've had in Ayurveda is this idea of not having like a really strong evidence base in the United States, despite the fact that it's been used for thousands of years successfully in India and is widely, widely practiced. Do you think that's going to change?
Yes. And partly because the science will take us there. I mean, I know that sounds so obvious, but I really believe the science will take us there. And so though it may take another couple hundred of years to really get to the tricorder reality, which I guess I'm maybe just a little early. I was kind of hoping for my lifetime to have a tricorder. And by that, I mean a deep and powerful assessment tool that then gives very novel and individualized treatment pathways. But I do think the science will take us there, because the way that I've always viewed it with Ayurveda is that it was based on millions of case studies. And case studies are valid scientific discovery. They may not have the same evidence base as a double-blind placebo, but when you're talking about something as vast as a human who may have trauma, who may live in the desert, who may not have access to food, who may be in an abusive relationship, these factors that are difficult to extract from when you're trying to draw correlations scientifically. But in Ayurveda, there is a deep and firm understanding that each person is different even in each moment, and that what could be recommended from moment to moment could even vary. Of course, that can extend vastly into seasons and to age and to region. The science, I believe, as we understand better what turns genes on and off, what regulates the autonomic nervous system, what provides deep and abiding sleep, what gives us a sense of compassion and joy and purpose, actually can be incrementally impacted by external things, from air quality, household, setup, stressors, food, lack of movement. They say sitting is the new smoking. I mean, there's so many ways in which I think we're going to understand that all these little micro decisions that are happening every day have that additive impact to how the genes are creating the tissue and creating the action of the tissue. And that was all profoundly observed and understood by the ancient Ayurvedic teachers. Perhaps they had, without the modern distractions that we do, even more pathways and capacities for inner awareness that, in my frame of reference, are divinely guided. But again, you could apply a scientific lens of just discovery, questioning, revision of theory. And again, this sort of begs an interesting question, which I have had with some of the classically trained Vaidyas from India, which is, how much could we ask Ayurveda to evolve into the modern era? That some things that were written or spoken of, do they need to be adjusted or taken with a grain of salt or truly integrated into the science that we have now? And I think that's more of a philosophical question. We may, the answers are never 100% clear.
I get so excited. I get this kind of goosebump feeling when I get a booking from a new client that I haven't met yet. And I get so excited because I know that somebody has made a decision to go really, really, really deep into their healing. Because I know that Ayurveda is not a quote unquote normal thing that many people have access to, at least not in the United States where I live. So I know that when someone books with me, that they've really made a decision that they want to go deep into their healing. And so you could do that on my website at heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. You can book me for either a Ayurvedic consultation if you're ready to dive in, or you can also book me for a 15-minute connection call if you're not sure where to go yet. I do have a couple offerings that are not on my website, and we could talk about that. So I look forward to meeting you. Well, I think it's an important question because many of the sources that are used in Ayurveda are based on specific solutions in a specific environment, plants that grew in a certain place or a manifestation of a disease that looked a very specific way in a certain environment. That, to me, it's important that the principles are the most important things to apply. And obviously looking at the specific solutions that Ayurveda developed to treat certain things is wildly informative,
Yes.
but is also not perfect because the context is different. So I really think that's a good question that you've asked, and something I know that, we as, because I'm on the National Ayurvedic Medical Association board, it's certainly a question that we contemplate a lot. It comes up in because it's dangerous when you take any knowledge, whether your source is an Ayurvedic text or PubMed. If you take some data and, with just a very limited view and don't really understand the context in which you're applying it. But what you're saying about, the fact that each person is different in each moment is so tricky because it's hard to study that, isn't it?
It really is. But I do think this is where I think the science will help us. And again, this is me just waning philosophically, but I do think the wearables will evolve to internal devices at some point. And the amount of data collection that will be happening from blood glucose, true hormonal measurements, real time, sleep patterns, brainwave patterns, autonomic nervous system patterns, peristalsis, the whole kit and caboodle, detoxification patterns, kidney function, oxygenation levels, waste, removal, all of that at some point is going to be measured in the human being. I think that the acquisition and interpretation of that data is going to be through AI, because it would just be completely overwhelming for any clinician to have oodles of data like that sitting in front of them. But I believe that AI will begin to show trend lines. Wow, this person went outside. It was hot and bright. They were not hydrated, and their blood sugar did X, or their nervous system did X. And eventually that data is going to intersect with these whole person healing systems like Ayurveda and traditional Chinese medicine. And I actually believe that though they aren't aware of Ayurveda, that some of the people in I call it the biohacking community, where they're looking at ultra high performance, they're actually moving in that direction. And when they learn Ayurveda, terms in Ayurveda, concepts in Ayurveda, it often feels very familiar to them because they themselves have seen when I want to function optimally. And I think this is an important distinction here, is that most of what's happening, at least in the practices I was part of in the allopathic community, is average function or, absence of disease. But there's a really different field. I like to call it vitality medicine or optimal medicine, where you're actually looking at the optimal expression of the human arc, the journey of a human being. And high performance athletes and others in that sort of genre are very specifically looking at many different patterns of their life because they see it in how they can perform and how they can show up athletically. And that group has a very intuitive relationship to how vast and how complex interpreting all this data is. But they're doing it. So I do believe it's possible. I believe AI will be part of that bridge in how we study it, quantify it, and make recommendations. Though personally, I think nothing will ever replace human interaction. And at the end of the day, clinically, if you've studied a million things, but it's all just information and not wisdom or knowledge, then it is problematic. And I think that's sort of what we're talking about here abstractly, is that any individual healer understands they themselves are also part of the healing equation for someone. Their presence, their ability to support that person to activate themselves to then go forth and make the decisions that will be transforming for them. Because much of what happens in an Ayurvedic or lifestyle medicine consultation asks of the person to change things they're doing in their day-to-day life, not just replace a botanical for a pharmaceutical. And that's my biggest pet peeve, if I had one, to be honest with you, is that notion that integrative medicine is just a botanical for a pharmaceutical. It's couldn't be farther from that.
Siri Chand, our brains in our free time, I think, spend energy thinking about a lot of the same things.
I love it.
Because this thing about the wearables, and it's funny because one of the things I present about a lot is fasting, and fasting as a practice of self-study and also, a gentle way of cleansing. And it seems to me that, and this is also related to the statement that you made earlier about the people who originally wrote the texts for Ayurveda as having maybe some more awareness that we don't have today as society has gotten more developed and we've been bombarded with more and more information, that somehow there's a level or a type of awareness that has gotten compromised in humans as time has gone on, that it's changed and that it changes even as our lifestyles change and as our daily routines change, and whether or not we have a meditation practice. And I've experienced it myself because I meditated every day for 6 years, and then I didn't when I got pregnant because I was absolutely nauseous and couldn't feel my body. But having that experience of the inner awareness and how it connects me better with the outer world, there's a part of me that worries about there being so much use of these wearables, because it just feels like it's then going to perpetuate this problem of humans not feeling their bodies, humans not knowing themselves. And at the same time, I understand that there's a point where a human does become disconnected from this awareness, and that then these tools can help bring them back. So I'm thinking about certain special populations like autism. Like these wearables are, I know somebody who works in this field that they're using a lot of the wearables for autism to be able to predict when someone who's autistic is going to have an outburst, for example. And so anyway, there's this romantic part of me that's like, can we really help people just recapture this internal awareness so that we don't have to create all these wearables and give them to everybody?
Right.
And just in these special situations, you get them. But like, if you have the capability, don't rely on that.
Right. It's an interesting time we're in, right? Because I have definitely seen that the wearables can drive behavior shifts and changes, the aura ring. There's a number of them. At the same time, to incorporate a meditation practice and to listen deeply and to be intuitively guided from that space, to me, is still more powerful. But that's my personal journey and experience, and may not be valid for someone whose constitution and brain spirit continuum are wired differently. And so I think it's valuable to appreciate that some people just may not be wired for that intuitive process in the same way. And it really behooves them to have another route. But again, it's an interesting discussion. And I think probably through the course of the rest of our lives, we'll see tremendous innovation in this. If we consider, I got my first iPhone in 2008. It was pretty primitive considering what we can do now on them. That's 13 years? So much has happened with the phones. And I think we're just at the beginning of appreciating where all the data that we're going to be getting is going to be able to be utilized. If I had a bias, and we had spent some time interacting in Clubhouse and meeting very interesting researchers and scientists, and I always would jump into these very clinical PhD, very scientifically driven. And I have a master's degree as well, and very classic science background, starting from a very specialized STEM high school. And it's very clear to me that a good scientist is interested in understanding and being curious about where they could get inspiration for what they're studying is. And that excites me. The idea that scientists and sages could sit together and inspire each other, as opposed to it being either or. It's a yes and for me. And I really do strive for that, because I feel like we're in a culture and a time that thrives on division. And I guess I feel like every action I take every day is trying to move energy back towards inclusiveness, that tend and befriend, if you will, I heard Elizabeth Glasser talking about the research around the feminine response to stress isn't as well documented to be fight or flight. It's actually more well documented to be tend and befriend. And that's the place I'm trying to share and teach and cultivate community from. There's so much division, even just around so much of what's happening currently.
And I know that you're trying to help physicians, and this is a very important thing because we need our physicians not burned out. We need our physicians well, and we need them that way for themselves and also for them to be able to care well for other individuals and to be able to care for their families as well.
Yeah, it's actually a tremendous public health issue. I don't know that people actually understand the gravity, because when you need that allopathic intervention, you usually genuinely need it, whether it's an infection or high blood pressure or diabetes, a cancer. Almost always there's points of intersection and a need for the healing qualities within their own practice, within their own being, to be present. And burnout is it's an interesting word, and I think I actually did in the course that I provide for physicians. It's a 12-week experiential course that includes plant-based cooking, yoga, mindfulness, conversations with an Ayurvedic Vaidya, journaling, self-reflection, that we actually, our last meetup, if you will, of the last course we did, we modeled the Vata, Pitta, and Kapha burnout model. It's the first time I'd ever really looked at burnout from a doshic standpoint. So the wired and tired and hot and angry and cold depression, these different ways that burnout was showing up for physicians. And we sort of got into the psyche a little bit. And it's interesting because certain aspects of Ayurveda really speak to that. We move towards what's familiar inherently, which actually takes us more out of balance. And by bringing in things that may not be as familiar, we can perhaps cultivate balance in a different way. But medicine can be a frictionless plane for bad habits. So there's that piece. There's the clinical environment, which is largely, rigid and sterile, as you alluded to earlier, which makes for pretty miserable clinicians for the most part. The way that the fee structures and insurance, there's always people that can look in and criticize, but most physicians are trying to figure out how to create their own practice or leave what's existing or innovate within what's existing. But it's very, very difficult to do any of those right now, the way insurance has partnered with larger medical institutions to create the contract and fee structure, which often the smaller individual clinicians just cannot compete with financially. So there's so many different factors. And in the midst of that is this sense of disempowerment, a sense of fatigue, of being overworked. And so societally, we can't actually ask all the physicians to leave medicine, even though about 70% of them are experiencing burnout, at least in primary care, which means that they may be making mistakes or not fostering a healing environment, merely owing to the fact that they themselves are working very hard just to get by on a day-to-day basis, whether they're willing to admit it.
That is so depressing, to work so hard and to not be well. And I totally understand why so many medical doctors are wanting to explore concierge medical practices, but it's not easy, right? It's like a completely different business model, and it requires a totally different skill set because most medical professionals study to be clinicians. They don't study to be business people.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing with Ayurveda too. I think it's, you want to study so you can treat people, but you don't necessarily. And the Ayurvedic practitioners, they're not able to work in a system like that. So then they can't even make a living because they can't even get themselves in a system like that.
Yeah, it's pretty crazy, actually. I mean, really, that's my technical term for it. It's pretty crazy. So
that's definitely a technical term.
Yeah,
I think it's in the DSM-5.
Yeah, that's casual me speaking. I caught myself. But I mean, ultimately, I have a sense of wonderment and frustration at such a profound level. And sometimes when I say something like, that's crazy, it's sort of it's too vast for me even to come up with adult vocabulary for. It's just such a mess. It's just such a mess. There's so many layers of dysfunction in it from start to finish.
And I love that you were saying how, because oftentimes when we're in a difficult situation, we will look for ways to improve it, or we will look for ways to get out of it, or ways to influence it, because everybody wants to go to work every day and have a good day and feel well and feel like they're doing a great job and feel like they're helping people and feel like they're getting what they need as well. And you mentioned this idea of that the clinicians are trying to figure out how to cope with that. And how do you think Ayurveda could support this idea of clinician resiliency?
Well, one of the ways I love this question, and one of the ways that I think is so powerfully overlooked, as I was moving through my medical education, there was a lot of this internalization of the idea of mind over matter, meaning push through having to eat, push through having to sleep, push through having to use the bathroom, push through wanting to see friends, push through time with family, all to support the ever growing demand that medicine would have time wise on your day to day existence. And so there's this subconscious belief within medicine of let's just push through. It's mind over matter. But in Ayurveda, interestingly enough, I like to turn that upside down and say it's matter over mind, meaning the mental, emotional, spiritual states that we're in are largely predicated on some of the things that are happening physiologically and that we're inviting in through our day-to-day routine. And in Ayurveda, this is known as the dinacharya, or how you've created the flow and rhythm of your self-care for the day. And so in this sort of Ayurvedic introduction, it's certainly not meant to be treatment and assessment of advanced diseases. It's really looking at what could be shifted in our day-to-day lifestyle that actually might impact our sense of mental, emotional, and spiritual well-being. And by managing that physiology without having to add a lot in, I think it actually, and I've seen it, actually makes a pretty profound impact. Even simple things such as shifting breathing, paying attention to the senses, meaning some physicians are on the screen for 14 hours a day. And I've taught them how to do a simple meditation to relax the eyes or to look away from the screen every 20 minutes for 20 seconds, looking at the self-care of the body, the routines that go into massaging and application of oils that are nourishing to the senses and nourishing to the shifts that have happened due to this constant movement within their lives, within their mind. And so, a lot of what's being used for burnout is mindfulness. And don't get me wrong, it absolutely is helpful. But this is sort of going much further with these very simple, very straightforward processes that through some reflection and slowing down, which we do in the course, we learn together these self-care techniques that nourish the body so that there's a little more buffer before a reaction arrives. And when we're only in that reactive state, boy, life gets pretty raw. And so I'm not actually thinking we're actually going to have a huge shift in how medicine is practiced. In the next 20 years, I'm doing this type of work. I imagine it may even get a bit worse. So we have to find these high yield tools that move the needle so that people can stay with some longevity into careers they do actually love. Most clinicians I know feel so honored and privileged to be in that sacred relationship with people where they hear their most vulnerable thoughts, feelings, and experiences. So I think that's how Ayurveda can be so profound, is through these simple incorporated practices that might take an extra 20 minutes every day, but over time have an exponentially additive impact to sense of well-being, probably prevention of disease, though I don't have any scientific evidence of that. But I'd probably rather go through any process physiologically if I felt more balanced mentally, emotionally, and spiritually.
Siri Chand, I know that you are a huge proponent of plant-based cooking and that you teach people how to use food as medicine. And you probably know that I'm not a huge fan of cooking. it's one of those things that I wish I loved more, but I like having friends who like to cook. So
The
this is
best.
good. And frankly, the reason I like that is because I want to like cooking more, but I just really don't. And it's kind of funny. But what specifically plant-based, it's obviously a very trendy thing right now, but why is it so important for people to explore it, especially right now in society?
Wow, beautiful. I love being given the opportunity to speak about this. So to know me is to know that I love the earth. I love gardens. I love thinking about how the earth nourishes our physiology. She is the ever-giving mother, from botanicals to vegetables, grains, legumes, anything that we're really putting into our body is coming, when we're plant-based, is coming from the earth. And I believe we're at a critical time where looking at how non-plant-based protein sources, the animal industry, the impact to the environment, the impact to earth, the impact to our own being needs to be looked at thoughtfully, carefully, and critically. And from a health standpoint to impact on perhaps more deeper and profound aspects of our being. Making the directional movement to plant-based is something that even large medical institutions are speaking about, because it's really apparent that a nutrient-dense diet is ultimately going to give our body the best opportunity. I'm not so focused that someone who may not share that value with me is wrong, because ultimately each individual has to assume their role in the collective. And if they're able to do the best work they can do with a diet that's not plant-based, then apparently that's what's best in their reality. However, I do feel that in this time that we're in, looking at the rainforest, deforestation, the impact of feeding animals foods that are not even their natural foods, and the growing of those foods, what that's done to farming practices, the introduction of glyphosate and similar pesticides and herbicides into our ecosystem, into our beings. These are questions that require, I think, focused attention. And so I really encourage everyone to jump into reading more about it, not just assuming that what you hear on social media is the last stop in the story. And people can become very heated over aspects of the plant-based diet that they feel are not nutritionally valuable for them. And I always like to just pull that camera back further and further and say, if we are going to incorporate meat into the diet, then looking at regenerative agricultural practices, looking at things that find more synergy in the production of food so that we have an earth to continue with. So there's a preservation and a conservation aspect to a plant-based diet. There's also, just for me, taste and flavor. I love plants. I love the flavor, the vitality, what they bring into our consciousness to me is very valuable. And of course, there's the health benefits. And I think the data is growing and growing. I think one study I saw that showed a huge difference in all-cause mortality. I think it was 40%. So if you had someone who had one serving of plants per day versus 7, there was a 40% difference in the impact to the end of life and how that emerged. So my philosophy has always been for each individual to strive to find what would give them the optimal experience of their health and their vitality so that they can serve with compassion, with clarity, with kindness to the planet what's needed, what their individual gifts are, what their capacity is. And I think that the further we walk away from that philosophically, meaning let's consume, let's take, and not thinking about how we can function optimally to give back, to serve, we march ourselves towards trouble. So it's kind of a roundabout, not totally clear answer, but for me, it's so multidimensional. Why would a plant-based diet be so important?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I know that it sounds like from what you said earlier that food and your relationship with food even has played such a big part in your own healing and your study of food. And it sounds from what I've heard, since I haven't been to medical school, but what I've heard from Dean Ornish is that, and maybe that's changed now, but he said that physicians are only getting about 4 hours of nutrition training in medical school. Has that changed?
I believe it is changing. And some of that is coming in through the integrative medicine curriculum that's being offered through the Arizona Center for Integrative Medicine that's been incorporated into medical schools. For the record, I don't even think I got 4 hours. All I learned was biochemical pathways. I didn't walk away from any of my training with a single useful nutritional skill. Like not one class, not one handout, nothing. So really everything I've learned has been a process of discovery in my own life and then extending that to people I work with.
It's so great then that, because I would imagine there are quite a few physicians who feel that gap. And it's great that there are people, I know a lot of them will study Ayurveda, may study other things as well, but it definitely seems, especially if somebody's interested in understanding the functional influences of the relationship with food.
Exactly. And there is a growing field, which is pretty exciting, called Culinary medicine, which is actually a certification that physicians can get to teach cooking and nutritional concepts to patients, which I think is fantastic. So there's a lot of classroom demonstrations, visits to farmers markets, looking at the most economical ways to get the most nutrient-dense food. It's a wonderful growing field, and I'm really excited about that. That is an area of innovation in medicine that really excites me.
That's super cool. And it's going to help the physicians too, because it's going to help them feel less burned out. So it sounds like it's a win-win for everybody.
I know, it's the best.
That's so cool. Well, Siri Chand, thank you so much for being here on the Wisdom of the Body. I've enjoyed our conversation so much. And when someone hears this podcast and they want to get in contact with you, what would be the best way for them to do it?
First of all, thank you so much, Heather, for inviting me and for creating this podcast. I love your intention and the guests that you have and the conversations you're creating. So the best place to find me is usually on social media, Dr. Siri Chand. You can Google that. I'm on most of the platforms. So if you're looking for recipes, I have recipe boards on Pinterest. If you are interested in fun plant photos and inspiration, I'm on Instagram. I have some cooking videos on YouTube and a Facebook group where people can share ideas and have conversations around plant-based eating. So there's lots of places to find me. I have a website, drsirichand.com, that also would be a great place to start to get to all those channels.
And she has an eye for beauty, so you will see beautiful things when you look at pictures that she's taken or videos that she's done. She can make things very beautiful. I don't have that gift as much. I'm envious of that.
It's always been such an important part, that creative outlet. There was so much math and science. I don't know, it may even be a bit extreme, but there's just that part of me that was always like, okay, beauty and creativity, let's do it.
Oh, thank you so much for being here, Siri Chand.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you for tuning in and dropping in with us today. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. I really want to hear your feedback. To learn more about my work, visit heathergrish.com. That's Heather, GRZYCH.com. And meet me here next time on the Wisdom of the Body.